Thank you for joining us, Mr. First. Tell us about your scholarship on the subject of the Purim story. Who were Esther and Ahashverosh in extra-biblical sources?
Okay, so let me say, I worked on this for 20 years, and this was a major article in my book, Esther Unmasked. Most of the things that I'll be talking about tonight are in the book Esther Unmasked, which you can get from Amazon or from CodishPress.com. Okay, so, and basically I'm going to give you a summary here, but there's really much more in the Esther Unmasked book, which has 11 articles on all the holidays. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about Ahashverosh and Esther in secular sources, which again is one of 11 articles in the Esther Unmasked book. Okay, so basically the problem with the Megillah is one major problem, which is that the Megillah just plunges into Ahashverosh, does not say Ahashverosh ben so-and-so, right? It does not say who came before him and who came after him. And this created a problem for 2,000 years for everyone. Okay, now I'm gonna explain who he is, but just trying to understand the whole background here. So the Megillah itself doesn't say who he was before or after. In the book of Ezra, in the 4th chapter, there is a context, but the problem is that the chapter is written in an unclear way, so it confused people. So I'm gonna explain. We're gonna solve that problem in a few minutes. But basically, that is potentially the clue. But because this chapter was written in an unclear way, it just confused everyone. Okay, but what is clear? What is clear is that there was a king Koresh, and he allowed the Jews to go back. And around 20 years later, just around 20 years later, the temple was built in the reign of Darius. So this is like basic principles you have to, understand in order to absorb what I say afterwards. That first there's a Koresh who allowed the Jews to go back, and then around 20 years later, in the reign of Darius, the temple was rebuilt. So now, the Gemara, Seder Olam and the Gemara, they put Ahashverosh between Koresh and Darius. Okay, so you should always remember this. According to the official Rabbinic Chronology, CAD, Koresh, Ahashverosh, Darius. Okay, if you ask a person with traditional background, they're going to say Koresh, Ahashverosh, Darius. But you're going to see in a few minutes that really this is not correct, and Ahashverosh exists, but he's the one after Darius. Okay, so this little trivial difference, but it has major consequences because it means that the temple was up. And the rabbis in Gush all understand this. This is not just me saying this. Like the Dot Mikra understands this, and all the rabbis in Gush understand this today. Okay, but that's where I'm heading here. Okay, so basically, this is the problem. That the Megillah itself doesn't give enough clues. Now, and for 2,000 years, we only knew the names of the Persian kings from the Greek historians. Okay, but in like the 19th century, the scholars were able to figure out the ancient Persian writing in the ancient Persian palaces. Okay, then all of a sudden, the original Persian names came to light, and they found out that this king that the Greeks were calling Xerxes, or in English we write that Xerxes. This king, his name in Persian was Hasyarsha, and then they found like around 1900, they found this name written in Egypt in Aramaic inscriptions from Egypt, Chetchin, Yud Reshin, or Chetchin, Aleph Reshin. So basically, Xerxes was not this king's name. His real Persian name was Hasyarsha, and obviously this is the same name as Ahashverosh, just as the Megillah has an Aleph in the front. Okay, so, and the reason the name got botched was because the Greek doesn't even have a shin. So if they don't have a shin, by definition, they're going to botch the name. Okay? Now again, I'll explain this all more in the Esther Unmasked book, but these are the basic principles here. Okay, but once you realize that Ahashverosh is Xerxes, so now we know all about Xerxes because Herodotus wrote a major book on the ancient Persian kings, and a third of his book is about Xerxes. So Xerxes is the son of the Darius who built the temple. So again, he reigned 486 to 465 BCE. And the temple was already in existence, it was having been built in the reign of his father Darius. But the other thing you need to know about Xerxes is that he was involved in a war with the Greeks, and he was out of the country for year 5 and 6. So this helps explain the Megillah. There's a gap in the Megillah from year 3 to 7. Why did it take him so long to find a new queen? So this partially explains, why that took so long. The other important thing to know is that in chapter 2 of the Megillah, it talks about someone who was exiled in the reign of Yechaniah, and we were all kind of taught that it's Mordechai. But that doesn't work. That means that Mordechai would be too old, because Yechaniah was at 597. But it's very simple. You just have to read that verse as that Kish was the one who was exiled. Mordechai ben Yair and Shimi ben Kish. So instead of reading it as Mordechai was exiled, Kish was the one who was exiled in 597, and then all the dates worked out. Okay. Now, before you want to ask me anything based on anything I said so far, I'm going to go. We're going to do the 4th chapter of Ezra now. But everything I said so far is clear enough, right?
So far, so good.
So far, so good.
Okay. So usually I give this year with handouts and everything, but just basically what we're going to do now, we're going to just read a few verses in the 4th chapter of Ezra, and when it's all over, you could go by yourself and look it up. But you have to look at the right edition. You can only use dot maker, okay? If you use traditional editions, the chronology is messed up. So you got to use the dot maker when you read this, okay? So in the 4th chapter of Ezra, the context is the Jews have come back. Koresh lets them start rebuilding, but they start running into problems. So in verse 5, or chapter 4, verse 5, it talks about the Samaritans, and they're complaining in the reigns of Koresh, Ba'ad, Daryavesh. Okay, now. See, Ba'ad teaches you that someone's in between. Like if Koresh and Daryavesh were adjacent, then it would just say Koresh bid Daryavesh. But it says Koresh Ba'ad, that teaches you that someone's in between. Now the next verse has Ahashverosh. So Chazal, meaning like the Gemara and the Seder Olam, they put Ahashverosh in between Koresh and Daryavesh because he's the next verse, and they understood that someone was in between Koresh and Daryavesh. But now that we understand that Ahashverosh is Xerxes, now we can look at these verses anew. Koresh Ba'ad Daryavesh, that's Koresh Cambyses Daryavesh. Right? See, we know Herodotus tells us that Cambyses is in between Koresh and Daryavesh. And then the next line is Ahashverosh, that's Xerxes. He's in exactly the right place. He's the one after Daryavesh. Then verse 7 talks about a king Artaxerxes, and that goes till verse 23. And then verse 24 returns to the main narrative. See, what happened here, there's a digression. In chapter 4, the author wanted to do a complaint to the reigns of Koresh Ba'ad Daryavesh. And then the author said, by the way, there was another complaint in the reign of Ahashverosh. And then there were more complaints in the reign of Artaxerxes. But then he goes back to the main narrative of Daryavesh in verse 24. But you see, when there's a digression and there's no parentheses and there's no footnotes, this confused everybody for 2,000 years. So this is the whole thing. The evidence was right here, but you had to know how to understand this chapter. And only once they understood linguistically that Ahashverosh is Xerxes, then they were able to understand, oh, this is a digression, and then they went back to the main narrative. I know it's hard to understand what I'm saying without the text, but if you go look at the text, you'll understand. There's a digression, and there's no parentheses, there's no footnotes, and it confused everybody. Okay, so now I'm going to go to we're going to talk about Xerxes' wife, and we're going to try to identify Esther. Okay, now. Okay, Herodotus writes about Xerxes' wife, his main wife, and he tells them her name, Amestris. Amestris, that's how they would write it in English, but the Greek is basically the same thing, Amestris, okay? So now, he only mentions her three different passages, alright? Now, one of them is just a weird thing she did before she died. Another thing is a cruel thing she did, but today, you see, everybody knows not to believe the cruel thing. See, the Greeks and the Persians were enemies. Herodotus is a Greek, and he's telling stories about the Persians. So, fundamentally, he's writing about his enemies, but it's even more than that. When he's writing about the women in the Persian Empire, the stories are always outlandish, okay? So, he writes crazy stories about the Cambyses' wife, Darius' wife. So, today, the scholars know, even though Herodotus tells a sad story about Amestris, you don't have to believe it. This is fiction, not history, okay? Okay. So basically, what does Herodotus say? But what does Herodotus say? He says that Amestris was the daughter of a military commander named Otani. All right? So Herodotus is very clear. This is the main wife, that Xerxes' main wife, Amestris, and she was the daughter of a military commander named Otani. Now, first let's talk about the name Amestris, okay? see, we don't have a Persian source for her name, but we can work backwards from Herodotus. If he called someone Amestris, that we can deduce that her Persian name had the consonant MSTR. So how can we do that? See, why was there an ES at the end of Xerxes? Because in Greek, when they take a foreign name into their language, they have to add these suffixes like ES or IS. Sometimes they add ON, like Shlomo and Solomon. But basically, in order to fit the name into their language, they have to put these Greek endings in. So the IS at the end of Amestris, that's just a Greek ending. Okay? So basically, all you have to do is look at the consonants. So the consonant's MSTR. So what are the consonants of the name Esther? STR. So you have STR and MSTR. So basically, is it a match or is it not a match? I mean, it's a trick question, but it's not an exact match. But basically, it's an overwhelming match mathematically to have three consonants the same in a row, coming out the same. Okay, so Esther and MSTR, that's essentially a match. Probably her name had an M at the beginning, and it just didn't get picked up in the Hebrew. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. Okay, so basically, there's one little stira. The one little stira is that he gives the name of her father as Otanes, a military commander. Now, the Megillah says the name Abi Hayil as the name of Esther's father. So this is a contradiction, but Herodotus has 50,000 details. No one ever believes everything he said. If 40% of what he said would be correct, that would be a tremendous victory. So, nobody ever said Herodotus everything he said is correct, and that's would be a ridiculous proposition. Okay. Also, he's writing 30 years later. He never went to Persia. He didn't examine records. He's just a rumor reporter. That's all he is. So he got it wrong. It's a big deal. Now, the other thing, very interesting also that Abi Hayil even means military commander. And just one other just interesting idea is that in the Megillah itself, Esther is given a different name. She has called Hadassah. So we see from the Megillah, not the Midrash, in the Megillah itself, she's got two names. She's called Esther and she's called Hadassah. So perhaps this person Otanes, or actually, called Persian name might have been Otan. Maybe he had a Persian name that was similar to maybe he had a Jewish name that was similar to Abi Hayil. So again, Herodotus, the contradiction here, but it's not a winning concept. Okay. I wouldn't lose one night's sleep over this, okay? Because Herodotus, he's just writing on rumors, and no one ever said you have to believe anything. No one ever said you have to believe, 50% of what he said. So it's not something that really worries us.
Wait, so the information that he's giving is not it's not firsthand. It's coming down the grapevine.
No, right. He's writing 30 years later. He never even went to Persia. He didn't examine birth certificates. It's all
he's collecting information,
rumors.
and then okay, I understand.
He says that. He says I'm just reporting rumors. So no one.
Okay.
It's not a serious. It's not a winning contest. It's a nothing. Okay. All right. Now, but the thing is like this. See, the Dot Mikra and Chamesh Megillot, they think Amestris was the main queen and Esther was on a lower level. See, most people who write about this, they don't realize they could chop off the IS. In other words, when Herodotus writes about Amestris, you have to know the trick. The trick is the IS is just a Greek addition. Just get rid of it. But if you don't realize that, then you think the names don't match. So the Chamesh Megillot, the intro in the Dot Mikra there, he says, well, Amestris was the main queen, but Esther was a little bit of lower level. But it's interesting that the Dot Mikra to Treasar, Volume 2, Appendix, page 3, he's willing to suggest that Esther equals Amestris without discussing it. So, so that's the basic situation. Esther is Amestris. Don't worry about 99% Esther is Amestris. Don't worry about the cruel story that she did. And the kasha that Herodotus, the kasha based on the name of the father, it's not a serious kasha.
The fact that Abi Hayil means a soldier is, to me, very interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating, right?
Yeah, it's just such a coincidence. It's horrible.
I'm not even relying on that. I mean, also, I think, let me try to say this also. When it says when Esther was chosen, she was taken to the palace, and she did not reveal her true ancestry. It says she did, right? So it could have, years of rumors could have developed over who she was from. Okay, so that,
Yep.
Okay. So all right, so that's the basic outline of Ahashverosh and Esther, check the sources. But again, there is more to say because there's another Greek historian named Theseus, and he tells a few more bad stories about Amestris, but Theseus has like no credibility whatsoever. Anyway, so like Herodotus, people believe some of what he said. Theseus, no one believes anything he says. So even though he tells more bad stories, you don't have to believe it. Okay, so I'm basically ready to move on to the next topic, unless you want to.
Very interesting.
Fascinating stuff. Okay, so we wanted to ask you about your findings in regards to the shortened time span of the Second Temple period that's apparent in Chazal.
Right. Okay. Okay. So this was my master's paper at Revel. I studied under Dr. Sharon. And then my master's actually got published as a book. It's called Jewish History and Conflict. Okay, so it's all about this topic. But it's a very expensive book. I don't control the pricing. It's very expensive, and all right. And by the way,
I'm familiar with the book. I don't have it, but I'm familiar with the book. I did not realize that was you. Wow. Okay.
All right. But also just realize in that book, it's in 1997, I mentioned the possibility that Esther was Amestris, but I raised it as like a possibility. I didn't, it took me, 10 years to get to write my more updated stuff where I took the position that Esther is Amestris, but in the book, I mentioned it as a possibility. Okay. I think part of what happened was there was a great book that I read by Persia and the Bible by Edwin Yamauchi, and that's where I learned that Herodotus never went to Persia. See, and that was a big insight. Then I realized, it's nothing. He's just a rumor reporter.
Hearsay.
Okay. All right. So my master's under Dr. Lyman then became this Jewish History and Conflict book, which was then actually in 1997 there was something called the Jewish Book Club, and this was the book of the month in the Jewish Book Club in August 1997. Okay. Anyway, before we get to the Second Temple period, I just want to mention one thing that people don't realize, and that is regarding Bayit Rishon. The official Chazal number is 410, whereas in secular history it's 380, like 966 to 586. So there we have another contradiction. There, Chazal have 30 years to more. I don't know if you're aware of this. Most people are not aware of this. Okay, because there the Bayit Rishon number for Chazal is 30 years too big, and the 410 number itself is kind of weird because that's not in Tanakh. You add up all the kings, you get like 427 and a half. That's a separate issue. How come 427 and a half became 410? But okay, but again, okay. So leaving aside that 410 versus 380, okay, that would not deserve a book. I mean, short book, but not a big book like mine. Okay. So basically, the Chazal's chronology. I'm trying to explain the count from creation today. This is really where it all comes from. So the Tana Rabbi Yossi in the 2nd century, he was the author or the final editor of Seder Olam Rabbah. And what he was trying to do, he was trying to go from Adam to his time, from Adam to the second Korban, right? He's trying to go from Adam to Korban by Cheney. He's trying to give the dates, the totals, but he's trying to do it based on Tanakh. But what's the problem? The problem is that Tanakh doesn't go till Korban by Cheney. Tanakh ends in the middle of the Persian period. So you have a Greek period, you have a Hasmonean period, you have the Roman period. You don't have enough data from Tanakh to do what he wants to do. But he thought of a way to solve the problem. He utilized a prediction in Daniel, and then he picked the endpoints of that prediction, and he made one of the endpoints be Korban by Cheney. So Daniel chapter 9, there's a 490-year prediction, and Rabbi Yossi in Seder Olam Rabbah, and he says it, he cites this verse, he says, the 490 years run from Korban by Rishon to Korban by Cheney. Now the endpoints of the prediction are unclear. Okay, so he had some liberties here in terms of how he was defining the endpoints, but but obviously he wanted to go to 70, so he made that as one of the endpoints. Okay, the secular world, they have a big problem. No one really understands what the endpoints are of this prediction, but at least Seder does take this position. So once they took this position that 490 years from Churban Bayit Rishon to Churban Bayit Sheni, and since they knew that the verses talk about 70 years for the exile period, so they're left with 420 years to Bayit Sheni. So that's where it all comes from. In other words, Rabbi Yossi is following a prediction in Daniel, and from there he's deriving, these numbers 70 and 420. But now, you see, but everybody knew at the time of the Churban Bayit Sheni, they were counting a Minyan Shtarot, Seleucid era, and everybody knew what year it was on that count. That started at 312 BC, 311 BC. So basically, the Churban Bayit Sheni was like year 380 on the Seleucid era. Okay, so see, he only left himself 420 years for Bayit Sheni. So basically, he only had 40 years left for the Persian period. So this is what this is what caused the whole problem. That he follows his predictions on he picks certain endpoints, and because the latter parts of the Second Temple period were known, and he's forced to put only 40 years. He only had 40 years left for the Persian period. Now, see that, and now also those Persian kings. There's only like 4 Persian kings in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. And what Seder does, he does something very weird. He turns those 4 into 3. Like there's a verse 6:14, and there's a verse that says Daryavesh ve'Artachshasta, and Seder decides that Daryavesh and Artachshasta are the same person. Now everybody knows this is difficult, and many Rishonim disagree with it. But the point is that Rabbi Yossi must have known that his chronology might not have been exactly right, because he's forcing him to equate Daryavesh and Artachshasta, in verse 6:14, where it says Daryavesh ve'Artachshasta. But I don't think he really knew how much he left out. Okay, so basically that's what's going on here. That he followed a prediction of Daniel, and he boxed himself in, and he only had 40 years left for the Persian period. But I don't think he really knew that he was really leaving out, many Persian kings in many years. For example, like the period from Cyrus to the last Darius, from Cyrus to Darius III, is 207 years. Whereas, in Seder they give that like 52 years. And, there were really 10 major Persian kings, where Seder kind of takes the working Tanakh and turns them into 3. So this is the topic of my book, how come you have these 2 chronologies? But, again, it's not like Seder made an arithmetic mistake. It's not like he's relying on unreliable sources. No, he decides to get his chronology by following a prediction in the book of Daniel. In my book, now, I didn't have to really solve this problem, because people had already figured out this is what's going on. But basically, what I did in my book was I summarized 100 different people, and I explained, 95% of 95 people are writing wrong ideas, and only these 5 people, are writing the correct ideas. But I explain why everybody's wrong, and the only people whose ideas make sense are the ones who are saying that Rabbi Yossi is following this 490-year prediction in Daniel. Now let me now I have to explain a few more things here. The Seder chronology is followed in the Talmud, and the ArchScroll follows it. So what this means is that, like, all the BCE dates in all the ArchScroll books that are prior to Alexander in 332 BC, all the ArchScroll dates are wrong. Any ArchScroll date before Alexander, before 332, is going to be wrong. And when you have children, eventually when they get to 7th grade, they're going to start asking these questions. Well, how come? In one book it says the book of Esther destroyed the temple in 586, and how come the ArchScroll book, gives 420, right? How come, the secular book says Darius built the temple in 516, and how come the ArchScroll book, says 350?